think we're going to move on to a PowerPoint presentation, and we're going to talk about the domestic violence death review committees across Canada. And I was interested earlier on, I don't know if you're able to follow this, Myrna, but Annalie had posted a poll, and half the participants weren't really familiar with domestic violence death review committees. So This is an ideal presentation for our final day. So Myrna and I are going to give a quick overview about domestic violence death review committees in Canada and across the world, and then we're going to be joined by a panel of representatives from different provinces across the country who are doing this work. So just a reminder, the purpose of a domestic violence death review committee is really to learn from domestic homicides in order to prevent deaths in similar circumstances in the future. And the analogy I always draw, it's like looking at a plane crash. If you were looking for a black box to figure out what happened, was there pilot error? Was there bad weather conditions? Was a runway too short? Was there some problem with the aircraft manufacturer? Every death deserves a thorough review. And we know we can't bring back passengers from an airplane crash. We know we can't bring back domestic homicides, individuals who've lost their lives to homicides. But we can be damn sure we're going to do a thorough review to understand what were the risk factors, what were the missed opportunities potentially to intervene, and what are the recommendations we can make for changes in so many different areas, changes to legislation, to policies, to practices. What can we do around public education and training for service providers? And on the slide, there's some really great references. In particular, I'd highlight Myrna's book that looked at domestic homicides and death reviews and looked at this work going on across the world. Back to you, Myrna.
Thanks, Peter. So for those of you who haven't heard of these initiatives before, they really began in the early 1990s in the United States, where there's currently an initiative called the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. And right now there's between 175 to 200 review initiatives across the states in the United States. Then at the bottom of the screen, we have Canada, but we actually were the next country to implement a domestic violence death review initiative in the province of Ontario in 2002 and 2003. And this was followed by New Zealand, Australia, I think New Zealand in 2008, Australia 2009, and then the UK in 2011, where they have domestic homicide review processes there as well. And currently, Portugal has also just implemented a death review initiative. In Canada, beginning with Ontario, and that's when Peter and I first began working together in, I think it was the early 2000s. We did the foundation paper for the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee and published that in 2004. So it was the first committee that was implemented in Ontario, and then 7 jurisdictions, including Ontario, now have either consistently regular committees or committees that meet every few years to review domestic homicides. And as you can see on the screen, we have a link there to all the reports, and the year that's listed in this slide is the year in which the most recent report was released from that jurisdiction.
Every death review committee has a number of recommendations that get made, and there's patterns that you can see over time. For example, some of the most common recommendations relate to public education, because often friends, family, neighbors, coworkers have the most information about what's happening with the victim or are seeing the escalating violence from the perpetrator. So keeping neighbors, friends, and family and coworkers informed is really critical. And there's a number of excellent campaigns. Neighbors, Friends, and Family is a great example. There's a number of campaigns in most provinces and territories that tries to raise the profile of domestic violence and the reality that domestic violence may be lethal. Professional training is another big area. Often there's been reviews done across the country where there's recognition that we need to do more to inform child protection about the impact of domestic violence, mental health professionals, or sometimes police officers. So there's often training recommendations related to different disciplines and different service agencies. Collaboration is another key theme that comes up. Sometimes agencies are working in silos and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. There may be lack of collaboration even in the court system. The family court doesn't know what information the criminal court has, which could be critical. So clearly the need to look at sharing information, but also having high-risk teams. And Tracy Porteous did a great presentation on our panel the other day talking about some of the innovations in BC in this area. Changes in legislation are often recommended. And one big area, just as an example, we've seen a number of homicides in the workplace or domestic homicides where there's lots of warning signs in the workplace related to the victim and perpetrator. And we now see across Canada that there's changes in health and safety legislation that now recognizes domestic violence as a health and safety issue. A number of recommendations have looked at children exposed to domestic violence. Children are often overlooked, and on day one of this conference, I know Myrna and Danielle and Jordan highlighted some of the research findings about children, in fact, being at risk for homicide in about 10% of the cases, and many children losing one or both parents. And importantly, some of the recommendations increasingly have looked at the needs of marginalized populations. There's a different reality for Indigenous women, women living in rural and remote communities across the country, women who represent immigrant refugee populations where there may be barriers related to language and culture. So just highlighting some of the recommendations, but clearly there's hundreds of recommendations made by committees across Canada.
So domestic violence death review committees have mostly common goals, and that's the case internationally. And in the book that Peter mentioned that looks at these international committees, the first chapter by myself and some Australian colleagues and Julie Poon looks at what some of the similarities and differences are across these committees. But these also are differences across the committees in Canada as well. So for example, one of the first differences is that some jurisdictions have ongoing reviews. So they're consistently reviewing cases that occur annually. And then other jurisdictions do reviews every few years and do a group of cases and release reports at that time, compared to the ongoing reviews, which often lead to semi-regular and semi-annual reports. Another difference is whether it's a formal review through medical examiners or government agencies or community agency or advocacy groups. And there's a lot of differences across the world in terms of where they're housed. And for the most part, in the Canadian context, we see them in the corners or the medical examiners' offices. But there's quite a number of examples in the US that are community agency or advocacy groups. And I think both umbrella organizations or umbrella groups provide some benefits and challenges to housing the death review processes. Another difference is with respect to access about information. And so the type of information that is reviewed by death review committees can vary considerably across the different review committees. So some of them will have the voices of victims and family members involved. Some will be limited to more official versions of events. So there's a lot of variation across the types of information accessed. The ongoing monitoring and review of recommendations is also another key difference. And there's only, I think one or two death review committees currently that do ongoing monitoring and review of recommendations. And actually in Australia, one of the Coroner's offices actually has it in their Coroner's Act that there's a mandate to respond to those recommendations. Another key difference in terms of resourcing is funded versus voluntary characteristics. So some of the death review processes are funded with official funding. Some of them rely on the voluntary labor of the people who serve on the committees. So this leads to differences in resourcing and the ability to deliver outcomes as well. I've already mentioned the active role of survivors versus professionals. So I think currently we see that the death review processes are very much focused on the voices of professionals as opposed to the voices of survivors, and this is the case internationally. as well as in Canada. And this is something that I think that a lot of groups are grappling with. But in the UK, for example, the survivors and family members have a very significant role in the review process there. And then finally, with respect to public sharing of the findings of the review committees, again, some groups, some review committees release reports on an annual basis with the recommendations and some case summaries, whereas other ones release limited information at periodic points in time. So lots of similarities, even though they have lots of differences, even though they have common goals. Over to you, Peter.
So clearly there's a number of positive outcomes from death review committees across the country. And again, as Myrna indicated, probably challenges to making sure that the recommendations are followed up on. And clearly some of this depends on public advocacy to ensure that recommendations that make sense are actually implemented. But the positive outcome, I would say, would be an increase in public awareness and public awareness campaigns. Certainly an increase in public education campaigns. And again, I mentioned earlier that, for example, in Ontario, there's a Neighbours, Friends and Family campaign. There's an Indigenous version, a Francophone version. There's an immigrant version that's in Ontario, is in 14 different languages. So there are efforts. I mean, it's a positive outcome. The challenge is making sure that it gets spread far and wide in terms of the information being shared across communities. There's been an impact in professional training. And as an example, as a registered psychologist in Ontario and a member of the Death Review Committee, I was involved in reviewing a case where there's a recommendation that psychologists should be doing thorough risk assessments as part of their custody assessments. What was interesting that several months later, I received a notice from the College of Psychologists that shared a summary of the case and a summary of the recommendations and had links to resources. So it was an interesting experience in the sense that I was both on the committee and then I was a consumer of the recommendations that went to thousands of psychologists. I just use that as a very concrete example of a positive outcome. Domestic violence in the workplace I referred to earlier. So that's an example of legislative change. Again, in large part, it happened because of homicides related to workplaces. And obviously in Ontario, we had a high-profile case of Laurie DuPont, a nurse who was killed by her ex-partner, who ended up committing suicide. In that case, it was sort of the final impetus to have the province of Ontario look at changing workplace legislation to include domestic violence being seen as a health and safety issue, where employers who know or ought to know that one of their employees is dealing with domestic violence, that action needs to be taken. And we know from national surveys in Canada that domestic violence follows victims to work in over half the cases based on a national survey. A critical issue related to children is the role of children's aid societies, child protection across Canada. Clearly, there's a need for enhanced training and collaboration with the violence against women sector. It's another area where different systems are working in silos, and this is an area where there's been more cross-training and increased protocols between violence against women agencies and child protection. Another critical issue was police training and risk assessments, and this is an area that has changed quite dramatically. We have a long way to go, but certainly as of 2021, the police in Ontario, as part of police standards, have to complete domestic violence risk assessment. It's part of their mandate, as part of their job when they attend a domestic violence call. So this has been a critical part of police training, and obviously a theme we'll come back to is that the risk assessment has to lead to safety planning and risk management. And the risk assessment can't become an end in itself. So that's one of our ongoing struggles to move from this positive outcome to really meaningful changes.
So there is positive outcomes, and you know, as it does seem like these initiatives have been around for a while, particularly in the U.S., but they're fairly new, and so I think with initiatives in their infancy, there's always going to be challenges. And I'm just going to go over some challenges here, and I think Julie posted a link to an article that I just published that sort of summarizes this. So I won't go into a lot of detail in interest of time, but I just want to flag some of them. So one of the first challenges is promoting and publicizing the reports. I think, you know, when a death review gets implemented in a jurisdiction, there's a lot of attention right off the bat. It's a new initiative, people are paying attention. But once an initiative is around for a while, and this is characteristic of all initiatives, people start to forget and they start to not pay attention. So the reports can then be released and people will not maybe pay that much attention to the recommendations that are coming out of it. So the promotion and publication of the reports is key to what Peter was talking about in terms of some of the positive outcomes, and that is increasing education and awareness. A second challenge is access to experts in complex topics. And this is a sort of a multi-factor issue, I think. In the first sense, it's very difficult to get every expert at the table that you would probably need at the table of a death review committee in terms of all the groups that are responding to domestic violence and people experiencing domestic violence in their life. So how do you bring those experts to the table to make sure that it's representative of the sectors that you need and those actually that have the power to go back to their agency and implement change? So that's one aspect, because you can't have, you know, a committee with 100 people on it. One approach that has been taken with this is a couple of groups have actually appointed advisory committees. So they draw on those individuals periodically when there's specific topics that come up around immigration, for example. Or you can invite experts to the reviews depending on the cases. The other aspect to the experts on complex topics is how these initiatives actually arose. And these initiatives largely came out of the feminist movement and the anti-violence against women organizations back in the 1990s, but internationally and locally, there's an absence of feminist voices on these committees, people who bring a really focused gender-based lens or sex-based lens on the topic of domestic homicide. And so this is something that's been discussed globally. Some jurisdictions have actually mandated in some countries that there has to be at least one or two people from the anti-violence against women sector, so it's part of the legislation. So that's an issue that's been challenging, that some of these voices are not represented adequately. I've already talked about briefly about the voices of surviving family members and friends of the victims, and this has been a key issue over time. You know, balancing how it can be cathartic for surviving family members and friends of the victim to be involved, and on the other hand, it can be traumatic for them. But there's also the common understanding that surviving family members probably hold a lot of information in their hands that is very important to a death review process. And I already mentioned the United Kingdom as a key jurisdiction that has done really well in this regard, because they actually have an agency in the UK that was started by the brother of a woman who was killed, and his nephew was killed. And he started an organization that supports people who want to be part of the death review process. Funding, again, is a challenge that I mentioned. This requires funding in order to do the aggregate review or even one-time reviews. So having consistent funding over time, we all know in this sector that funding is often sporadic as opposed to consistent, so that does vary over time. Community membership and confidentiality is an issue that sort of draws attention to the presence of a more global review committee, so it's a state-based or a province-based review committee, or if it's a local review committee. In either case, if you want to have community membership, there is issues around confidentiality. And in the case of homicide-suicide, which often doesn't lead to the perhaps arguably in-depth investigations that would normally occur if a case was proceeding to trial, we often lack information on homicide-suicides that might be held in the community. And so if they're not at the table, or there's no way to get that information to the table, whether through community membership or voices of surviving family members, then information on homicide-suicides may be less so than other types of homicides. Specific versus general recommendations on social change. I remember when I've served on the Ontario Death Review Committee for 15 years, and we often had, issues where it was clear that poverty was an aspect, but, in order to make a recommendation about poverty, how do you make a general recommendation like that, and who do you target it to, and how do you follow up on that? Versus specific recommendations that are very much grounded in the actual case that can be, the rationale written about that particular recommendation can be clearly linked to the case. And so there is the need for social change, and we talked about that throughout the past 3 days, and we will again today, but it's also the need for specific recommendations that can actually be implemented on the ground. Measures of success has been another issue that's come up quite often. Many point to a reduction in domestic homicides as one of the measures of success. And I've talked about this to Peter and many other people. I actually caution against using a reduction in domestic homicides as a measure of success, because there's many factors that go into the rates of domestic homicide, as we've heard over the course of the last 3 days. And so if all of a sudden the domestic homicides don't go down because, for example, we have a pandemic, then that doesn't mean that a domestic violence death review committee was not successful or did not have an impact. It means that homicides occur because of a whole host of factors, both at the individual and societal and community level. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges I think that faces death review committees is the implementation of recommendations. And I talk about this in the article, and there's a number of chapters in the book that Peter mentioned that talk about recommendations and how we actually really currently don't know systematically what is being recommended across the country, across the world, when it comes from the recommendations. But when it comes to implementation, we know even less. And so if we're going to really use the potential of the death review initiatives that have been implemented across this country and across other countries, we really need to understand how we're going to assess the implementation processes and the outcomes of those implementations. So some challenges, some of them big, some of them are going to be ongoing and people will approach it differently, but they are questions that need to be kept in the back of our mind when we're thinking about the death review initiatives over time. Over to you, Peter.
Yes, we're very fortunate to go beyond the PowerPoint and the overview that Mur and I presented to actually hear from people on the ground who are struggling with this work from coast to coast to coast. So we're fortunate to have representatives from 5 provinces who are going to join us on a panel briefly. If we look at the next slide, just to properly introduce them, I would indicate, I think as Myrna mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned repeatedly, that full bios for these individuals are found on the conference program. But just to highlight, we're fortunate to have Deidre Bainbridge, who's actually chair of our Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, also provincial nurse manager with the Office of the Chief Coroner. We're fortunate to have Stephanie Gamache, who's the chair of the Quebec Domestic Violence Death Review Committee with the Office of the Chief Coroner in Quebec. And they, as Myrna mentioned earlier, they just published their first report. Emily Casey, who's the chair of the New Brunswick Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. Laurie Moan, who is in charge of specialized investigations and the Death Review Unit with the BC Coroner Service. And Sarah Collins, who's Director of Community Safety and Wellbeing with the Ministry of Justice, the Attorney General, and the Ministry of Corrections, Policing, and Public Safety in Saskatchewan. She obviously has the largest business card that she carries with her to cover that whole title, and her full bio can be found in the program.